At this stage, we're coming to the plenary session, and it's my pleasure to chair this plenary session this afternoon. It'll be delivered by Professor Richard Toye of University of Exeter, who's published extensively on Lloyd George and Churchill, obviously key protagonists on the British side in both the War of Independence and then in the treaty negotiations. But first, it's my great pleasure to have the British Ambassador with us here today, Mr. Paul Johnston, who will introduce Professor Toye. The Ambassador, Johnston, has replaced Robin Barnett in September 9th in 2020 as the British Ambassador to Ireland. Originally, the Ambassador commenced his career in the Ministry of Defence in the 1990s before moving into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And he spent most of the 1990s dealing with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia before becoming head of security policy, department in the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and then became a political counsellor at the United Nations. And then he went on to Sweden before becoming Deputy Permanent Representative to NATO in Brussels. And from 2017 to 2020, he was UK Ambassador to the European Union for Political and Security Affairs. I'll just note at this point that the Ambassador has continued the tradition of his predecessor of conducting the Glencairn conversations. And there was a very fascinating conversation earlier this summer, which sets the background effectively for this conference, which is from the King's speech in June until the beginning of the treaty negotiations and the truce. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope it's not infra-dig to begin a speech at a distinguished academic event with a double plug, but I can't resist, following Mervyn's kind introduction, to say if any of you unaccountably missed the Glencairn conversation with Marie Coleman from Queen's University Belfast and Professor Lord Bew and Maurice Manning and Mary Daly, which we recorded at the Aviva Stadium back in the summer, it is available on YouTube, and there's a link to it on my Twitter account. So having got the commercial out of the way, I'd like to thank the organisers today, including Professor John O'Halloran of UCC, for the invitation to take part in your conference. I'd also like to congratulate everyone who's been working to bring these 2 days of discussion and lectures together in such a fascinating programme. The UK has a long history of friendship with Cork, and I'm sure many people, when they think of the visit of Her Majesty the Queen to Ireland in 2011, think of that iconic photograph of the Queen in the English market in Cork with the fishmonger Pat O'Connell. And on my own virtual visits to Cork earlier this year, I had the pleasure not only of meeting President O'Halloran and talking about cooperation between the embassy and UCC, of which today is a great example, but also to meet the famous fishmonger as well. I'm hoping to follow up with a real visit, in fact, several real visits to Cork in the near future and into the rest of my posting, given that in diplomacy, as in all walks of life, nothing beats real human contact. And that was one of the most important lessons I've taken away from over 20 years of doing international negotiations in the Foreign Office. I remember arriving at NATO as Deputy Permanent Representative in the summer of 2015, in the long build-up to the heads of government meeting we were going to have in Warsaw the following summer. And my predecessor had been scheduled to give me several handover sessions, and I had been looking forward to very detailed briefings on NATO's nuclear posture, how we engage with Russia, the next phases of NATO enlargement, policy on the Middle East. And instead, he gave me very detailed pen portraits of my 27 opposite numbers. And at first I thought, this is just a waste of time. Why do I need to know where this person came from and what his wife does or what her partner does and what their children do? But he said to me, you'll realise when you get into the business of negotiating with these colleagues, and particularly in the intensity of a summit negotiation, the fact that you understand a little bit about them, you know where they come from, physically, but also politically and personally, will make a difference. And it was something that I took away. And indeed, it's something that's occurred in many phases of my sort of career as a negotiator, that having that sort of understanding of personality and context is tremendously important. And It came to mind only earlier this year when I was reading the memoir of David Goodall, who was one of the key negotiators on the British side of the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985. And it came out in that so clearly about the relationships of friendship and trust that he and then Cabinet Secretary Robert Armstrong built up with their Irish counterparts, which were so important to that historic negotiation. And if you look back at the history of negotiations, I had the, I wouldn't say pleasure is the word, I had the distinct experience of negotiating with the Spanish on Gibraltar and with the French on European defence, and with the Russians and the Chinese on the Security Council on Iran. And in each of those, to understand the historical context and what it means for the countries involved is tremendously important. I remember discussing nuclear weapons policy with the French, and they had a sort of a little chronology of the evolution of their nuclear program. And in the middle of it was, not the middle, but towards the start of it was the Suez crisis. And I said, that had nothing to do with your nuclear weapons program as such. And he said, no, but it had a great deal to do with how we thought about autonomy and how we thought about our relationship with the US in particular. So I don't need to tell anyone in this audience today that a particular backdrop for anyone working on the UK-Irish relationship is the depth and the complexity of the overall historical relationship over many hundreds of years. I think one sees in the newspaper commentary on today's events in the relationship how often the present sort of is born out of the past and deeply relates to the past. And in the further plug coming up, in the seminar that Mervyn touched on about the genesis of the King's speech to the Belfast Parliament, it was fascinating to hear how themes of empire and European relations and transatlantic relations, as well as the bilateral relationship and internal domestic political factors, were all weighing on those who were seeking to influence the drafting of the King's speech. And it's been obvious indeed from the events of recent weeks that the so-called decade of centenaries, marking some of the key significant sensitive events of the 1910s and 20s in UK-Irish relations, still hold great resonance and still shape the political context for debates around these islands profoundly to this day. So your conference is, it seems to me, a fascinating opportunity to reflect on the processes which led to the conclusion of the Anglo-Irish Treaty at the end of 1921. And it seems to me, very much as an amateur historian, that it's excellent that the conference is looking at in such a multifaceted way, from the personalities and the concerns of those who are negotiating the treaty to the international context, the influence of women on the negotiations, and what the treaty came to mean for minorities in the Irish Free State, amongst many other examples. And it seems to me also that the priorities, the political context, and the pressures faced by the British negotiators are an essential part of understanding the story of how the treaty came to be. For some of them on the British side, such as Prime Minister David Lloyd George, the treaty came close to the end of their period in high office. For others, such as Churchill, it came much earlier in his case, exceptional political careers. But the different party affiliations, the departmental responsibilities, the personalities, the sense of priorities of the British negotiators must all have played a role, as of course the developments in domestic and international politics occurring at the time. Beside the prominent negotiators whose names will be widely known, there were always, of course, figures in the background, civil servants and others, exercising an important influence on discussions as they developed. Over 30 years, speaking personally, I've had the privilege to sit alongside a range of British ministers in various international negotiations, from Douglas Hurd in the early days of the Bosnia Contact Group, Jack Straw negotiating with his Spanish counterpart on Gibraltar, Boris Johnston in his time as Foreign Secretary in both EU and NATO councils in 2016 and 2017, on everything from Iran to Russia. I've also had the privilege of doing the job myself, sitting in the UK seat in the UN Security Council, the NATO Council and the EU Council, including as lead UK negotiator for the NATO Warsaw Summit in 2016, and negotiating on behalf of the UK and also on behalf of the EU when Britain had the EU presidency in the UN World Summit of 2005. And I felt at the time, and I feel now, in each case, it was essential to seek to understand the domestic political context of your interlocutors, as well as to understand, of course, your own, and to really sense what were the relevant bilateral, multilateral relationships. And as I'm sure we'll hear in the forthcoming talk, it was certainly been the case in all the difficult negotiations I've done. Personality, politics, pressures and priorities are a crucial part of the context. So it's with great expectation and great pleasure that I have the honour to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Richard Toye of Exeter University, who's going to speak to us about Lloyd George, the British Cabinet, and the treaty negotiations. Professor Toye, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Hopefully my screen is now successfully sharing. So very pleased to be here. I was asked to talk on the topic of Lloyd George, the British Cabinet, and the treaty negotiations in perspective. And you will see I've been a little bit cheeky and I've sneaked Churchill in as well. I've done that because I think he was a significant figure, not perhaps particularly during the negotiations themselves, but in the aftermath. And of course, what happens after the treaty is just as critical as the conference. And so what I want to do today is to sort of rethink in some ways the treaty and its impact and the way it came about. It strikes me, I was very interested to hear Chris Williams' presentation in the last session, the way in which the cartoonists sort of presented the treaty as a great success. Now let's move on. Let's talk about the next issue. Even somebody like Horatio Bottomley welcoming the treaty. This strikes me as remarkable because it seems to me that the treaty is a very sort of striking and profound event, not only in Irish history, but in British or UK history. And yet it seems to me that on the British side, it isn't remembered to any great extent. It hasn't completely dropped out of memory, of course, but it isn't seen as, it isn't perhaps given the significance that it deserves. Now, that said, perhaps we should be careful what we wish for, because if it were remembered, it is possible that it will be remembered in a more negative way. It strikes me that we often see sort of right-wing historians in the press, even and politicians sort of even trying to defend the Boer War and British behaviour during the war, which strikes me as rather extraordinary. But what they haven't developed, perhaps we should be grateful for it, is any kind of sort of narrative of grievance around the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which one could well imagine happening. We can think, for example, many people in Hungary today are still upset about sort of the treaty in the aftermath of the First World War. They feel their country was mutilated. One can well imagine that such a narrative could, in certain circumstances, have developed in Britain. It didn't. But I think that has come at the price of sort of a kind of amnesia. I think the treaty is in some ways treated as sort of natural and inevitable, and perhaps it was a natural outcome, but not entirely a natural outcome perhaps, and certainly not an inevitable outcome. So what I want to do today is to dwell on some of the personalities, but also on some of the bigger themes and contexts, which I think are important when reflecting on the treaty. And I sort of want to, in a way, put out to the audience this question of why this very dramatic event doesn't appear to have sort of really sort of seared into the British national psyche. Now, so thinking about this broader context, and some of this has certainly already been covered today, we have to remember that at the end of the war, the British had increased the territorial extent of their empire, particularly in the Middle East. But at the same time, that came with new problems and new challenges. These areas turned out to be difficult to control. This was, of course, also the time of the Treaty of Versailles and of what has been called the Wilsonian moment. That is to say, President Wilson's belief, which was widely shared by others, about the importance of nationality and the possibility of achieving peace if you could, if you like, segment different ethnicities, different nationalities into their own sort of individual boundaries. And if you do that in the right way, that would be the way in which nations could express themselves and live at peace with another. So if we see this sort of Sinn Féin poster on the right of the slide, the Czechoslovaks have demanded that have secured independence. Cannot you be as true to Ireland as the Czechoslovaks are to Czechoslovakia? You can ask for independence by voting for Sinn Féin. So clearly Sinn Féin is looking at a sort of wider language, drawing on a wider international global discourse of national independence. At the same time, of course, this makes things difficult for the British authorities. They are significantly overstretched around the world. There is civil disobedience in India, Gandhi coming to prominence. We have the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, which again forces some concessions from the British. There is the Iraqi revolt of 1920 in these new territories, and riots in Jerusalem. And I think also worth putting into the mix is the Russian Civil War, and the fact that the British were intervened and poured men and resources into that conflict to no very good effect. And so I think that on the one hand, as was mentioned earlier, it is simply the case that the British have got an awful lot of different things on their minds. As well as these international issues, they have domestic issues. Industrial unrest was mentioned earlier, but increasingly from 1920, the growing problem of unemployment is preoccupying the cabinet, so that when you look at the cabinet minutes and see the discussions about dealing with Sinn Féin, these may be lower on the cabinet agenda sometimes than the problem of unemployment. So on the one hand, the British are distracted or preoccupied by these other developments, at the same time as the empire is overstretched militarily, and you might say politically, but also these different movements around the world provide a context by which some people understand the rise of Sinn Féin. So in November 1920, in fact, echoing words which Edward Carson had already used, Churchill claimed that Lenin, Sinn Féin, and Indian and Egyptian extremists were all linked in a worldwide conspiracy to overthrow the empire. Now, Churchill is somebody who is quite able to, let us say, be flexible in his attitudes. And by the time just over a year later that he starts to in this position of defending the treaty, he's saying that Michael Collins and the treatyites will be very loyal to the empire. So he kind of radically reverses his position. But certainly there is a degree of conspiratorial thinking, and I suppose you might at least say that some of these movements did take a degree of inspiration from each other, even if they weren't collaborating directly. Now, to come to some of our key characters, Lloyd George, I think, sort of another point which really came out from the earlier discussion is that although the post-1918 years are often seen as a sort of disappointment in his career, that the trajectory is rather downwards, I think that the events of the treaty negotiations show him still at the top of his political form. He was somebody who exploited or attempted to exploit his Welsh identity. He tried to present himself to the Sinn Féin delegates as a fellow Celt. He certainly had a genuine belief, as Gladstonian liberals of the Gladstonian era typically did, in the rights of small nations, and this could apply to Wales, it could apply to Belgium during the when being attacked by Germany in 1914. It could also potentially apply to Ireland. And Lloyd George was, of course, in some respects, a radical liberal. He was somebody who identified as a pro-Boer during the South African War of 1899 to 1902. That didn't, of course, mean that he wasn't a supporter of the British Empire. He was rather, I suppose, like Barack Obama's view on the Iraq War. I'm not against all wars, I'm against dumb wars. And he thought the South African War was a dumb war. And he certainly believed in Britain's rights as a great power. And this becomes very clear in 1911 with the Agadir crisis, when he sort of makes clear in his speech at the Mansion House as a warning to Germany that Britain will not be treated as though she were no account in the cabinet of nations. So from 1905, he was a cabinet minister, first as president of the Board of Trade, then as chancellor, and in both those roles, he was extremely skilled in this period of growing industrial unrest in negotiating with the trade unions. He was an extraordinarily persuasive person, of course seen by many also as very devious, but these skills would come very much would be very useful to him during the treaty negotiations. And what about his actual sort of genuine, if you like, ideological opinion on Ireland? Well, before the war, he was certainly seen by some nationalist Redmondite MPs as a sincere ally. I think he probably was, at least at that point, but at the same time, there's some doubt about how sincerely sort of Lloyd George really believed in anything. And I think he was very good at persuading people that he was on their side. And in 1912, when the third Home Rule Bill is under discussion and is proving very controversial, Lloyd George, as well as Churchill, both of them really are the first people to be arguing in cabinet for the exclusion of Ulster, for some kind of special treatment for Ulster. And then in the aftermath of the Rising, Lloyd George makes efforts to make a deal between the Redmondites and the Carsonites. And he kind of I would say he gets as close as it's possible to get. I think ultimately the gap is unbridgeable, and that ultimately when both sides really find out what it is they're supposed to have agreed to, they back away quite rapidly. As long as he can sort of keep them in separate rooms, he stands some chance, but ultimately that the divisions are too wide for him to be able to sort of paper over the cracks. And the cartoon on the right from Punch, again, illustrates a very important point when we understand the political context, which is that Lloyd George from 1916 was the head of the coalition government, and from 1918, the conservative element in that government had been very, very heavily strengthened. And so he was in the position of being the head of a small group of coalition, relatively small group of coalition MPs, and really owing his government majority to the Conservatives. So the fact that he's standing on these two different barrels as they are presented in the cartoon ultimately is shows the sort of the instability of his position. And again, perhaps it's a sort of a tribute to his political skill that he succeeds in riding those two horses for as long as he actually does. But I think we'll come back to the significance of the coalition for the actual outcome of the treaty. And here, of course, Lloyd George is presented as using the sort of the mailed fist on Ireland and saying that reprisals carried out by the Black and Tans are only human nature. And you can see that he's sort of wielding or holding some kind of figure or document marked partition. So he used, we've heard already about the murder gang narrative, and certainly Lloyd George is somebody who uses that expression quite prominently and very much contributes to that narrative. And that, of course, is a narrative which it changes radically at the point of the truce and the start of the negotiations. Churchill also we should look at in more depth. So, of course, he was the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, who in the crisis of 1886 wrote a letter saying, Ulster will fight, Ulster will be right. We should also remember that Churchill had fought on the northwest frontier in India, he fought in Sudan, he fought in South Africa, always really going out of his way to look for a fight. really very literally, and was sort of bored in his normal military service, was out looking for adventure. And these really were dirty wars, which involved, for example, the use of dumb bullets in India. And so Churchill, I think, was somebody who wasn't going to be profoundly shocked. I think maybe he was, we could argue, originally traumatized by some of what he saw, but in the end, he wasn't shocked by the kinds of tactics that were used by British forces, and particularly by the Black and Tans. And so politically, over the years, Churchill holds virtually every position on Ireland that it's possible to hold. So he begins by, in 1897, with the legacy of his father in mind, I dare say, tells his mother, Lady Randolph, that Home Rule is the only issue stopping him from joining the Liberals. He, of course, remains a Conservative. He's elected as a Conservative in 1900, but then quickly does join the Liberals over the issue of free trade. Rather awkwardly for him, Home Rule, which had been in abeyance for a while, really since the sort of the death of the second Home Rule Act, sort of springs into life again, really as the Liberals come back to power in 1905. He gets his first ministerial job at that point. He's, in a sense, party discipline was a bit more flexible at that point, and so he didn't actually commit to Home Rule explicitly until 1908, when he was standing in the Northwest Manchester by-election. And as I mentioned, he continues to favour a special treatment for Ulster. And I think we also should remember that when the treaty was being negotiated, the negotiators on the British side were always thinking or drawing on examples from elsewhere in the empire. They were saying to the Irish, well, we don't intend to coerce Canada, therefore there's no sort of risk of us coercing you if you accept Dominion treatment. And one of the examples which is drawn on is particularly important to Churchill is the 1906 Constitution of the Transvaal, which Churchill, as a junior minister in the Colonial Office, helps negotiate and bring about. And this is about giving one of the former Boer republics sort of greater self-government in the aftermath of the South African War. And so in his famous, relatively famous speech in 1906 in the House of Commons, Churchill turns to the opposition and says, well, we've got this big majority, we can put the Transvaal Constitution through by ourselves, but if you support it, that will sort of change the dynamic. So with all our majority, we could only make it the gift of a party. They, that is the Conservatives, can make it the gift of England. And so this language of a constitution being a gift or being a sign of generosity on behalf of the British, again, is very important in the narrative which the British try to establish over the treaty. And then during the Anglo-Irish War, the Revolutionary War, Churchill is first Secretary of State for War and Air, and then from March 21, the Secretary of State for the colonies. And so in those two different roles, of course, he does have significant responsibility or involvement in the cabinet discussions. And he is also, of course, somebody who is perceived or presented by many as being a warmonger, a bloodthirsty person. And so in this cartoon, also by Lowe, we have him being presented as, on the one hand, talking up the idea of the League of Nations, and on the other, actually being in favor of more war. So he's pointing to lessons of the war, that war is hell for everybody, but then the lesson written in smaller letters is that we must improve our methods of slaughter and make a worse hell than ever for each other next time. And so the context for this is in May 1920, that he was forced to defend Sir Henry Wilson's comment. Wilson, as you know, was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, who had given advice to the men of the forces to keep themselves fit for the time that is coming. And Churchill justifies this comment, which may actually have some other significance, by saying that we had to protect our enormous obligations in Cologne, Constantinople, Ireland, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Egypt. So again, that context which I was mentioning earlier is being raised here. Now, I would also give an additional context, and the context which I mentioned already are well known. This, I suppose, is my interpretation, so that I think that there are lots of episodes which occur between 1912 and 1922, which are very well known in themselves, and yet actually need to be linked together. And so this is what I'm labeling a crisis in civil military relations. There are lots of individual crises, and I want to suggest that these were actually symptomatic of a broader crisis, which fundamentally emerged because of the military, and in particular the army's mistrust of the Liberal government. And so the army, the military, are egged on by the Conservatives. So in 1912, famous speech by Andrew Bonar-Law says he can imagine no length of resistance to which Ulster can go in which I would not be prepared to support them. That rhetoric, of course, feeds into the Curragh mutiny or incident, however you want to label it, of March 1914, where it becomes quite clear that the Liberals, the Liberal government really can't enforce its will on Ulster. You can't get the military to do what it wants, at least in the Irish context. And equally, you might say that when war breaks out, the Irish problem fades temporarily into the background, and Asquith appoints Kitchener as Secretary of State for War. That may look like a masterstroke, because you've got a key, very famous, much admired military figure fully on side. Of course, Kitchener is in himself a problematic figure, and this doesn't really solve the problem. We could talk about the role of Sir John French in the Shell scandal and sort of collusion with the press in order to, to make allegations against the government, which, together with the clash between Churchill and Sir Jackie Fisher, the First Sea Lord, triggers the fall of the Liberal government and the creation of the Asquith coalition. We could also see that in 1916, was the failure to halt the executions after the Rising a signal of a military that had got out of control. We could talk too about Lloyd George's clashes with Haig over military strategy. We could talk about the Morris debate, when it was alleged that Lloyd George had withheld troops from the Western Front in advance of the Ludendorff offensive. I think other things which we could post-war put into this civil military relations crisis frame are the controversy over the Amritsar massacre, which bursts out in 1920, and the feeling on the behalf of the diehards that the government is not backing up or actively undermining people like Dyer, who are, in their view, acting righteously. And then, of course, Wilson, we saw his comment about the men of the 40s keeping themselves ready for the time that is coming. Well, was that an innocent comment, or what was he really getting at? After he stands down as CIGS, he is elected as AMP, and then, as we all know, is sort of murdered by the IRA. That in itself doesn't make the problem go away. We could say more about perhaps the Chinac crisis, and whether or not the Liberals at that time, or whether or not the coalition government at that time was able to enforce its will when wanting to confront the Turks. But I would, although there's no sort of exactly fixed point where this crisis starts and where it ends, I think at the point where a Conservative government takes over, then actually this is, the crisis starts to fade away. And so I think this is very much a specific sort of problem, first of all with the Liberals, and then to a certain extent also with the coalition. And so I think the basic problem in relation to Ireland is that the government doesn't always absolutely know. It's at loggerheads with Henry Wilson often, doesn't absolutely know if they give an order to the military, they can't be absolutely certain it's going to be obeyed. And I think that's significant when thinking about the origins of the treaty. And we also, I think, in trying to think about why the truce and negotiations came about, again, the so-called sacking of Balbriggan by Black and Tans in September 1920, a most extraordinarily violent episode, again, not something which is remembered at all, I think, in Britain today. It certainly deserves to be remembered. But I think it was a turning point, not necessarily because it was more violent than previous episodes, but because on this occasion, there were journalists, British journalists relatively nearby, who brought the story back to Britain, which rather started to change the narrative from the IRA simply being seen as a nuisance, and the Black and Tans being seen as engaged in a kind of police action. I think this does create a degree of shock, at least in some sections of the public and of political opinion. And so, again, to turn to cartoons, here we have another low cartoon. And although we really see the British and the Irish and the IRA being portrayed equally negatively. So we see the Black and Tan meeting the murder club, and the Black and Tan is saying to the murder club, hello, what side are you on? And the murder club, the Irish, reply, justice and liberty, and you, and the Black and Tan replies, law and order. So there's obviously heavy irony here, but although the murder gang narrative is clearly still present here, it is almost as though now the Black and Tans are being presented as equally bad. So I think that public opinion in Britain does shift, and that this, as we'll see in a moment, has a impact on the British politicians. And again, I think another important context for understanding Lloyd George's actions is, first of all, changes in the British government machine, and also his own personal style of leadership. So, sure, you'll be aware that in 1916, when he takes over, he institutes significant changes in the machinery of government. Cabinet minutes are kept for the first time in order to better enforce the decisions that are taken. There is a cabinet secretariat. Lloyd George gets his own prime ministerial secretariat. And I think that these resources, which are then available to on the British side, are helpful to them during the negotiations. So Thomas Jones, Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, is a very important figure. And I mentioned earlier Lloyd George and his Welsh identity. Tom Jones is also Welsh, and that when he wants to talk to Lloyd George secretly, when they want to talk in front of these Sinn Féiners, but not let them know what's going on, they actually talk in Welsh. And so Jones records in his diary, still a very useful book, a very useful source for studying the period. In his diary for July 1921, Jones writes, I pointed out that Arthur Balfour was the most irreconcilable man in the cabinet with respect to Ireland. Maurice Hankey, the cabinet secretary, agreed, but said that the PM believed in implicating in the negotiations the most extreme opponent of his policy. So here we can see what Lloyd George's strategy was, that he knew he would have great difficulty bringing all shades of opinion round, particularly conservative opinion, of course, to making concessions to the Irish. And that therefore, what he does is to try and make them share responsibility. I think this is ultimately what he does with considerable success. And so at the time, one of the allegations against Lloyd George is that he's very high-handed, that he doesn't pay enough attention to Parliament, that he rides roughshod over people. He's seen as somebody who prefers to be swanning around at conferences, international conferences in the south of France, than to actually be engaging with domestic British politics. These are the things which, some of the things which damage him over the time. And it's certainly true that in some ways he could be seen as cultivating a more presidential rather than prime ministerial mode of government. However, when you look at the records, at least with respect to Ireland, I think you can see that he is involving other colleagues, not just because he wants their opinion or he wants to consult them, but very much because he knows that if he can get them up to their neck in the negotiations, they will be committed to it and will find it harder to reject the policy. And I think there's some evidence that this is why he included Churchill in the delegation, precisely because he feared that Churchill, who was quite often threatening to resign on things, could take quite extreme shifts of view, that Churchill was somebody who could potentially turn around and start campaigning, resign from the cabinet and start campaigning against an agreement with the Irish, and that by giving him a place in the delegation, Lloyd George has a chance of keeping him on side. So here are the people who are on the delegation. Some of them are chosen for their, by virtue of their position as Chief Secretary for Ireland, Hayward Greenwood, for example, or blaming Worthington Evans as Secretary of State for War. Others chosen for their sort of constitutional and legal expertise, such as Sir Gordon Hewitt, the Attorney General. I think Churchill was a more political choice. And then we might also think, in sort of asking the question, was the treaty inevitable? Well, also on the delegation was Austin Chamberlain, the leader of the Conservative Party, who was a considerably more pliable figure from Lloyd George's point of view, I think, than the previous Conservative leader, Bonar Law, who had stepped down temporarily, as it turned out, through ill health earlier in 1921, and somebody who had been something of an obstacle to reaching agreement with the Irish. So, I think we can ask, was the treaty inevitable? But we could also ask, was it inevitable at the moment which it came about? And so I think sort of the political configuration, which is in place at the end of 1921, is favorable to a successful outcome of the treaty. Now, I said I would say a little bit about public opinion, and these are the cabinet minutes from 6th of October, so just before 1921, so just before the conference starts, and they record, it was urged that if it was possible to enter a conference without the risk of recognizing an Irish republic, all would be well, and if the conference failed, the republic would never have been recognized by us. It was to be remembered, however, that the public had set their heart on a conference, and if there was a break without any meeting having taken place, it would be said that a conference might have saved the situation. General support might not be given to the government if it was to break with the Sinn Féiners because they would not say they accepted the crown and membership of the empire as a preliminary to the conference. So, of course, we don't quite know what public opinion was, but this is what the government thought it was, and therefore this placed constraints on them. They might have liked perhaps to have put those conditions on the Irish before the conference started, but they didn't feel that they could. However, that wasn't, as we'll see in a minute, a major objective of the British throughout the conference itself. And so I think that it is interesting to think that a lot of the negotiations were conducted with a view to saving face. And actually, at times, you can see that the British are prepared to do things to actually help De Valera save face, as long as they really don't want, what they won't accept is the idea of a republic or the idea of full independence for Ireland. But there are certain things that they will be prepared to do for De Valera if they think that they will help him save face and therefore be able to get him on side. We can sort of move to the negotiations and then have a quick look at Michael Collins on both Lloyd George and Churchill, as he left them in his notebooks. So on Lloyd George, born poor is therefore shrewd, was loyal, therefore crafty, nicknamed the Welsh wizard and for good reason, has a great deal of craft in his political methods and his diplomatic approaches, trust that his fatherly air and benevolence will overcome all obstacles, craft again. Now, Michael, he says, or now, Mick. On formal occasions, it's now Mr. Collins. He is not sure how far he can go with me, would sell his nearest and dearest for political prestige. I think that's important, that he's recognized that these negotiations to a good degree about saving face and maintaining prestige. So he hopes 1418 war, good and bad for him, hopes this affair will win him political prestige, which apparently he definitely needs, which I think was certainly true at this time. There were a number of reasons, including rising unemployment, that Lloyd George's position was weakening. Michael Collins on Churchill, don't quite know whether he would be a crafty enemy in friendship. Outlook, political gain, nothing else, will sacrifice all for political gain. Studies, I imagine, the detail carefully, thinks about his constituents' effect of so and so on them, inclined to be bombastic, full of ex-officer jingo or similar outlook, don't actually trust him. And so, well, you know, there's scope for argument about how far Collins and Churchill did establish a friendship or a warm relationship. You could argue that these notes were made at an earlier stage and that they didn't reflect Collins's eventual view, but I think I would say they show reason for being skeptical or cautious about a romantic view of the Collins-Churchill relationship. I think perhaps there was a certain, the relationship was important to both of them, and they went to efforts to cultivate it, but out of pragmatism and tactics rather than out of sentiment. And so coming to the treaty and the empire, as I've said, it was very important for the British government to present the treaty as an act of generosity and not as a humiliation. They had to be seen to be doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. That's how they wanted to be seen to be doing it, and not to have been driven to it. And so here again, there was the analogy with the idea of the Transvaal Constitution as being a gift. And so for them to maintain this, they need to keep Ireland as a dominion. They need to have the oath. And so ministers argue that actually potentially Ireland can be a strength to the empire if the causes of Anglo-Irish hostility are removed. So Worthington Evans, who we saw a minute ago, says the Irish may still be willing to share the glory and the burden of the empire, you know, if we can make this peace deal, and if the hostility goes away. But of course, the more that British advocates of the treaty argue that a free Ireland would be tightly bound into the empire, the more they give Irish critics of the treaty an opportunity. So Constance Markowitz argued, if we pledge ourselves to this oath, we pledge our allegiance to this thing. There's kind of real note of disgust there, I think, whether you call it empire or Commonwealth of Nations, that term coming more into use. That is treading down the people of Egypt and of India. So again, there is this kind of sense or feeling of solidarity with these other countries. And therefore, that obviously gives opponents of the treaty the opportunity to present Griffith and Collins simply as puppets, as they are portrayed in this sketch of April 1922, sitting on the knee of Lloyd George. Now, of course, I mentioned sort of the aftermath of the treaty and the importance of British support to the Free State during the Civil War. So we see that there were some tensions in the relationship. So, you know, documents we're going to see from the Churchill's papers, Michael Collins writing to Churchill, 29th of June, 1922, we are hampered by the continued lack of material. We were promised 200 rounds of high explosives at 2 a.m. this morning, but they were not available. The promise was renewed for 8:30 with like results, etc., etc. The effect of this is to create great lack of confidence on our side, amounting to grave suspicion. Essential that action is taken immediately, otherwise the situation will become impossible. So Michael Collins obviously has huge problems here. I think maybe he's talking about other people having lack of confidence and grave suspicion rather than simply himself. but he's kind of not happy with the situation at that moment. And here we have Churchill's sort of final letter to Collins, sort of commending him for the attack on the four courts. I believe that the action you have taken with so much resolution and coolness was indispensable if Ireland were to be saved from anarchy and the treaty from destruction. We had reached the end of our tether over here at the same time as you had in Ireland. I could not have sustained another debate in the House of Commons on the old lines without fatal consequence to the existing governing instrument in Britain, and with us the treaty would have fallen too. So again, the idea that the treaty is actually still, it may seem to the cartoonists like a done deal at the end of 1921, but actually there are still risks to it afterwards. And so, interestingly also, Churchill continues, he actually continues throughout his life to talk up the idea of a united Ireland. And so he's saying, from the imperial point of view, a word which he obviously likes, which I suspect Collins didn't really like, from the imperial point of view, there is nothing we should like better than see North and South join hands in an all-Ireland assembly without prejudice to the existing rights of either. Now, I think you could well think, well, this is kind of rather hypocritical of Churchill, because ultimately he was never prepared to, he was often prepared to talk about the United Ireland, but always, of course, on condition that the North would agree to it, which was a bit like saying, well, I agree to a united Ireland, but only under conditions which will never come about. So you could see it simply as warm words. I would actually say that Churchill probably did believe it was possible, that he had a belief in grand gestures. He had a belief that populations could change, their sort of emotional state could change very rapidly, and that sufficient grand gestures and sufficient magnanimity could bring about a kind of a revolution in feeling. So although I think that that was obviously wildly unrealistic, I think there was an element of sincerity in what he was saying here. It's also worth noting the P.S. I hope you are taking good care of yourself and your colleagues. The times are dangerous, which indeed they were. So to come to a conclusion, we can obviously see the treaty as a sensible and pragmatic compromise on both sides. And of course, some people on the Irish side saw it and may still see it as a betrayal. But as I was saying earlier, it's interesting that there isn't a British betrayal narrative. Nobody claims retrospectively the country had been mutilated, or if they did, these were voices at the time which sort of soon faded out. And so I think the treaty was something which was very much disliked by many conservatives, and ultimately it helped motivate them to get rid of Lloyd George in the autumn of 1922. But at the same time, they accepted the reality of the Free State. They accepted this change, which was an extraordinary thing for them to do if you think really the raison d'etre for the Conservative and Unionist Party was supposed to be preserve the Union. But ultimately, of course, they had made themselves responsible for this, or Lloyd George had succeeded in making them responsible for this. So I would argue that the treaty may seem in retrospect to have been inevitable, but actually it could only come about in very specific conditions. So that the fact of this coalition where Lloyd George could do the negotiating, the Tories could sort of lend their votes to it. In a way, did the Tories use Lloyd George? He was using them, but were they also using him to do what a Conservative government could not have done or would have had extreme difficulty in doing? So I would argue that the treaty not only created a new Irish state, a new Northern Irish state, but it also redefined the UK state in ways which we think about a lot less. And so although we know most of the facts, or we know an awful lot of important facts about the treaty and its negotiation, in some ways historians and indeed the British general public and the political classes have in important ways still not got to grips with what actually happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for a fascinating rich overview of the Lloyd George position, in particular the political realities that he faced. And it's that I wanted to turn, I'll ask one question. To what extent, you alluded to it there, to what extent was Lloyd George coming to the end of his political, shall we say, powers at this particular time? There were a number of problems, high unemployment, arguments with Churchill, in fact, I think, over this entire question. And to what extent do those sort of debates actually begin to intrude in terms of the dynamics of the British delegation on the Anglo-Irish Treaty?
Well, that's a very good question. I suppose I would say that he hadn't necessarily lost his political skill, but political skill isn't in itself enough to keep you going. So I would see him from 1918 onwards as a bit like Roadrunner in the cartoons, where he's kind of shot off the edge of the cliff, and it's a question of how long he can keep going, because ultimately the Bonner Law sort of famously says, sort of the little man can be prime minister for life if he likes in 1918, but then of course in 1922 is the key figure involved in turning him out. So the reality is always that the Conservatives, when they get fed up, they'll be able to sort of pull the rug from under him. And I think that as long as he remains popular, they're quite satisfied. And then when he's less popular, they start wondering, well, why isn't one of our guys in charge? Chamberlain isn't really going to push himself forward, and so the frustration is building. So I think that in 1921, during the conference, whatever political problems he's got are not sufficient to prevent him pulling off negotiating the treaty. But I think that then it actually creates more problems for him, and then things like the honours scandal kick in as well. So I think that he always had a limited shelf life. Was there a way in which he could sort of plausibly fight another election as the head of a coalition? Well, nobody really seems to think so. Certainly not by the spring of 1922. And by the spring of 1922, I think he's kind of jumping from one hot rock to another in terms of just about surviving from crisis to crisis. But then the Chanak crisis comes along, which is what he maybe thinks is going to save him by putting him in a position of national military leader. But that completely backfires.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I'm just looking at some questions here. Patrick Coleman's asked a question here. What part did was Griffith seen as playing in the negotiations? I suppose from the British point of view, was he seen as more marginal than Collins? You've mentioned Collins substantially there in the discussion.
Yes, I probably should have paid more attention to Griffith, said more about him. I think that, again, we've seen the media fascination with Collins. He's obviously an interesting figure about who Hollywood directors like to make films. There's never going to be a Hollywood film called Arthur Griffith, I don't think. And so I think it would probably be a mistake to underrate Griffith. And you've got to remember that it was a whole negotiating team, and it wasn't something which sort of Collins could have pulled off simply by himself. So I think it's probably true that I think that there's evidence that the British are paying serious attention to Griffith, and he's not some kind of dead letter or sort of insignificant figure.
You just said something extremely important there. It's part of, I suppose, the central reason for this conference is that there was an entire Irish delegation there, but obviously the popular perspective is that the focus, as you say, is on Collins for, shall we say, photogenic reasons and such like, or romantic reasons. But I'm wondering, you've likely read the documentation. Is there sort of an assessment done? There must be assessments done of the members of the Irish delegation, including the backup team, and what was their assessment of the team that the Irish sent to represent them in London?
They're also, of course, reading their mail, which is, gives them interesting insights. So I was reading, to refreshing my memory this morning, and in conversation, I think this is really before the negotiations kick off, they are, Lloyd George throws into conversation, well, I've just read a letter from De Valera, and actually he sort of uses it to almost make De Valera's point in that instance. I think that probably they are more focused on him than they are on the members of the delegation, because all in the summer when sort of all the focus is on him. So I'm sure there are documents explicitly sort of profiling them, but haven't read them recently enough to be able to give you direct quotations from them.
Okay, I've just got another question here from Rosemary Devereaux. In terms of, it's a question about the location and the venue. Whether the question of the location of the venue has ever come up, because obviously to a large extent, there's a symbolic importance, I suppose, in bringing the Irish to London to negotiate. But obviously that puts the Irish, as you've just alluded to, at a disadvantage, for example, in terms of communications. So what's your assessment of the advantage of the location in London to the British government?
I think you're quite right. And I think that my argument about the kind of the cabinet secretariat is also important. I think the ability to say, let's quickly draw up a position paper on this, whatever trivial aspect it is, so that there's quite a lot of negotiation and discussion of free trade, for example, and of tariffs, and of whether the Irish might put tariffs on Britain. I mean, that's a real sort of point of contention, which I think is sometimes forgotten. And essentially, the British can say, when somebody raises an objection about well, what about infant industries or something like that, they can say, well, yeah, maybe we could make an exception for that. We'll get somebody to look into it. So I think that sort of having that, really being the people who can circulate the papers is a considerable advantage, I think.
I've just got there's an interesting question here from Ronan Fawcett, and I'll read it directly. Without the Welsh wizard creating personal connections with Griffith and Collins over the period, could the treaty have been delivered?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to see who else could have managed to do it, I think. I mean, of course, we've got to remember that it was a team, and that Lloyd George wasn't spending all his time on this. He was spending time on other things as well. And I think that, we shouldn't, I don't know, I'm really tempted to say, yes, it wouldn't have happened without Lloyd George, not at that time. I mean, the question is, how long would things have had to have gone on before, I think in a way the British faced reality in the summer of 1921, but they didn't necessarily have to face reality then. It might have been longer before they did so. And the question is then, how much longer, how militarily speaking, longer could they have gone on? So I think that, in a way, it's sort of, of course, Lloyd George we've got to remember, he was both responsible for the black and tans and the atrocities, but he was also responsible for calling a halt to it. So he's a very, it's very difficult character to assess. But as I say, I don't think it was inevitable that the treaty was going to come about at this particular time. And indeed, what if Lloyd George had been run over by a bus or been run over by a political bus earlier on? Could this really have come about? Yeah, I'm skeptical about whether it would.
But that's an interesting observation, particularly in light of the opening remarks from the British ambassador Johnston there, the role of relationships being very important. Angus Mitchell has asked a question here. Would you be prepared to comment on the place or role that Lord Birkenhead played in the negotiations?
Well, again, I think it was an important role. Again, I think his legal expertise and background was important there. And also he was somebody who could well have been sort of tempted into the die-hard camp. We know that later on, as Secretary of State for India, he was very sort of uncompromising. And so I think that this was a good political decision by Lloyd George to include him, because again, he was getting a potential opponent on side and using his skills. So I think that he was, of course, it's not quite the only way to measure it, but if you sort of look at how many words each person uses during the negotiations, of course, being wordy isn't necessarily meaning it, but I think he's relatively prominent in the talks, and so yeah, we shouldn't underrate him either.
Okay, I've got a question here from Tim McKenna. Is a narrative that Lloyd George, quote unquote, tricked Griffith into accepting a boundary commission still accepted? They're acceptable.
I don't know. I think that that claim has always been contested. Really, there's different ways of sort of reading the language, and I think, if I'm right, that comes from a document which Tom Jones had provided to Churchill for the writing of the World Crisis, and I think that therefore it is contentious. So I don't think it is simply accepted by historians. And I think that Griffith was an intelligent guy. I kind of suspect that he knew the limits of what he was able to achieve.
Okay. Another question here from Michael. Did Collins take steps to protect his correspondence with Dublin at all?
You're going to need to find a Michael Collins expert to answer that.
Okay. Okay.
I saw an interesting one further up the chat. I can't quite read all the chat at the same time, but there was a point made that actually it was really the British who started the attack on the four courts. And the question is, do you think that Churchill really believed that Collins started it, or was he pointing out that Collins will be held responsible? Well, of course, he may not have had perfect information, I suppose, is possible, but I think that he's trying to, as you suggest in the question, was he pointing out that Collins will be held responsible? I think he is trying to kind of weld him into responsibility, if you like. So I think that what you're suggesting is a good interpretation. Okay,
and obviously there's a particular bugbear, I suppose, from an Irish perspective, and that is this constantly pulled out in public discourse about Lloyd George threatening war if Collins didn't and Griffiths didn't accept. Now, can you comment on that? Is that strongly based?
Yeah, and I think that what you've got to remember is that the British went into this, knowing that the treaty, that the negotiations could fail. They would, to put it another way, they weren't confident that they were going to be able to do a deal which was acceptable to them, and so they always had in mind that they might, in some way, kind of have to start up again, I think, and so of course, had Lloyd George sort of had the full assessment done by the army about whether or not they were really ready to do it, did they really want to do it, is a different question. But I think that he was good at negotiating. He was also good at bluff.
That brings to an important point Des Dalton's has brought here. Did Lloyd George effectively run rings around Griffith and Collins by separating them out from the rest of the Irish delegation and engaging them in private meetings, blindsiding the rest of the Irish delegation?
Well, I mean, I suppose you've got to, I mean, ultimately what happened, if you sort of look at the whole picture, is that the British had a set of conditions which, you know, there were certain things they were prepared to concede and certain things they were not prepared to concede. And I don't think that the Irish delegation were ever going to force the British to, you know, do away with the oath or do away with, you know, sort of membership of the empire. That was never going to happen. And so therefore, ultimately, the Irish delegation had to decide, you know, do we want to start all over again, you know, with the possibility of renewed war, or, as Michael Collins says, you know, does this give us the freedom to achieve freedom? So I suppose the question is, you know, really, you know, not that necessarily it was the result of trickery by Lloyd George. I'm sure he did his best. You know, he was always trying to sort of be persuasive and win people over using whatever tactics came to hand. You know, it's ultimately a judgment of, you know, were they run rings round or not? It really depends whether you accept the ultimate political decision. And I think that both Griffith and Collins ultimately knew what they were doing and that knew the risks that were involved in doing so, with, of course, you know, Collins's famous death warrant comment. Although I also think that, you know, maybe if he hadn't been so reckless on the day, he might have actually survived.
Fascinating insights there. A couple of other questions, and I don't want to keep you. You've been going for quite a long time. You've covered a lot of ground, and you've provided a lot of context, and you've demonstrated, I think, the complexity from the British perspective and the interdependent nature of the issues. So I'll probably just put forward a couple of other questions here and leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, this is a loaded question from Jerry White. Based on the content of the treaty, in Professor Toye's opinion, who won the Anglo-Irish War, or was there indeed a winner?
Well, I mean, basically, I tend to fall down on the, you know, this was in the end a sensible, well, a reasonably sensible, pragmatic compromise, and that in a way the British were insisting on things which on the face of it look slightly silly, and you know, and which didn't last, of course, in the end. And so you could sort of fault them for that. But again, I think the reason that there were good political reasons for doing that, which was in order to get it through the House of Commons, the British had to be able to hold up this kind of fig leaf, if you like. So, you know, I guess I'm, in most circumstances anyway, I'm in favor of peace and against war. So in spite of the obvious sort of flaws and problems and the situation that it arose, I guess if I was in Michael Collins's position, if I was in Griffith's position, I too would have signed it. And I think that equally a lot of responsibility for the problems subsequently, of course you can put them on the fact of partition itself, but the problems which derive from the behaviour of the Northern Irish government and the, you know, sort of Protestant establishment in the north. So you can imagine you can imagine partition, perhaps, you know, might be unrealistic, but to think that it could have been, it needn't have been conducted in exactly the same way that it actually was.
Okay, I'll ask one final question, and it's my question. To what extent did Lloyd George and Churchill anticipate a civil conflict as a result of signing the treaty?
I think they must have anticipated it to a degree. Yeah, they kind of knew it was a fragile situation. I mean, I suppose what I would say is they probably didn't sign the treaty thinking this is the end of everything and everything's going to be sort of smooth and straightforward from now on. They must have appreciated that the setting up of the Free State government was going to be kind of fraught with difficulty. And, you know, of course, they're also willing to sort of lend support to the Free State government in order to make it a success. So I don't think there's sort of any evidence really that they reacted with sort of shock or surprise to the outbreak of the Civil War. Rather, they sort of were ready to act in the way in which they thought was consistent with British interests.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Toye, for a very masterly overview of the British position and of leading personalities. Okay, and thank everybody for attending what I think has been a very successful first day of the conference, and the multiple perspectives. But I'd like to thank all the speakers who have delivered a very rich set of perspectives on the treaty negotiations. In addition to all the chairs, it's been a group involvement, it's been a group effort, and it will continue tomorrow. And I'd like to thank obviously the ambassador and Richard, and I hope to see you all here online tomorrow at 10 p.m. or 10 a.m. sharp. Okay, thank you.